benvenuti all'Istituto Italiano di Cultura. Every year I come together for il Giorno della Memoria. All the Italian institutions related to Italian culture organize a series of events, and so the Giorno della Memoria, Remembrance Days, it lasts not only one day, but more than this. And I want to let you know that on Tuesday, February 6th, at Calandra Institute, we will have a lecture, Nation Building Through Anti-Semitism, Fascist Italy and the Jew as Internal Enemy, by Ernest Yalongo. And Thursday, February 8th, at the Italian Academy, there will be a panel dedicated to space and geographies of concentration camps, how to preserve the memory of discrimination. On Monday, we had reading of the names of the Jews deported from Italy. And tonight, here at the Institute, organized by the Institute together with Centro Primo Levi, we have a conference about refugees, rescued force, and international politics, the case of Angelo Donati. And I thank Luca Fenoglio of the University of Leicester to be with us tonight. And to introduce our evening, I leave the floor to Natalia Indrimi, the director of Italian Primo Levi Center, and really a friend of mine, and I'm always happy to organize together with her and with Alessandro Cassin this kind of initiatives. Thank you. Enjoy.
I'm much smaller. Good evening and welcome. I have two small requests to please turn off your cell phones so that we can keep our concentration. And also, Centro Primo Levi has a publishing house, CPL Editions. We publish classics and new research, as well as memoirs from the Italian Jewish experience that would not otherwise appear in English. Some examples of our books are outside, and you're welcome to browse and purchasing them and reading them, and giving them out is a way to support our work. Thank you. Before I make my introduction, I would like to, we have a surprise that was out of the program, and I would like to introduce to you Mr. Eric Meyer, who is a relative, a cousin of, the son of a cousin of Angelo Donati, and a very close friend of his father and Angelo Donati were close friends, and through the years he has shared many memories of Donati with us, and I'd like him to say a few words. Please welcome Mr. Eric Meyer.
This is an unexpected honor. I didn't know I was supposed to speak. I'm very moved by it. In 1954, after my wife, who recently was deceased, and I went to Paris, and as part of a second honeymoon, Angelo Donati made it one of the, well, we had gone to Italy as well because I had so many relatives in Italy. Most of my father's brothers and sisters lived in Italy. Some very famous one, Enzo Sereni, was a cousin of my father. His wife was actually the blood cousin. The Segres were in my family, the Finis were in my family, the Montefiores were in my families, Italian families. And so we had taken a trip to Italy and subsequently to Paris. And when we arrived at the station, we had no idea. A chauffeur came to meet us at the train, and it was the diplomatic limousine of Angelo Donati that took us to the hotel, subsequently to his apartment where we met his adopted children who had the same experience we did. They lost our parents as we did, both my wife and I. And he made us feel very comfortable. We were two kids. We just had been married a year before. And we were a bit intimidated by all of that. But he was extremely gracious. And he invited us the next day to a gathering of some very important people that helped to win World War II, people that basically also ran the French government for some time, one prime minister, one minister of finance, René Meyer and Daniel Meyer. And he introduced us to General Beadle Smith. Some of you might remember who he was. He was Eisenhower's chief of staff. And that was quite intimidating. And it was at the Club Interallié, where officers and leaders of the military from World War I and World War II, from the American, British, and French army, would get together as a social club. We also met at that particular time Jacob Zur, who was the first ambassador from Israel in France and was basically responsible for Israel having nuclear weapons. He negotiated the deal with Shimon Peres. Quite intimidating for two kids that had just gotten married. He loved my wife. He was very, very, very attentive to her because she had just found out that her parents had also died. But he knew my wife's family because my wife's cousin owned Galerie Lafayette. They were the Bader family and the Heilbronn family. The next day he invited us together with his two adopted children, and we had a fabulous Italian lunch at his residence on Rue de Berry. And for the next couple of days before we left for London to meet with to see my grandfather, my uncle, my aunt, his limousine took us all over Paris. And then the night before we left, he gave us what I would call a gala dinner where he invited some very important people. As I said, it was quite, for two young people that had just gotten married, it was quite overwhelming. But what I want to tell you about Angelo Donati is some that he had obviously diplomatic standing. He was very close to my father, very, very close. We lived in Germany, in Worms, Germany. And Sally Meyer was my father's brother, so he was Angelo's brother-in-law. He knew how hard things were for us in Nazi Germany between the years of 1933 and 1938. And he used to come by car over the Alps to Germany to comfort my father and my mother. And that to me means more than anything in this world. But it told you who he was. He, with all his diplomatic standing, with all the notoriety he had, he never forgot what comes first. We knew about his activities in Croatia. We knew about his activities in the Haute-Savoie and Alpes-Maritimes in France. But family was first to him. And for that, we loved him, we missed him, and thank you for listening tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer, for giving us a first-person account. I will try to be short in my introduction. I don't know if I'll succeed. This is the first lecture of a series that during the spring we will dedicate to the study of survival. Within the experience of the persecution, the persecuted took action, tried to do what their place in society, their connections, their knowledge, their imagination, their education, and fortuitous circumstances allowed them to do. And each person followed an itinerary that led them to either demise or survival. For decades, scholars and witnesses have written to give an account of how millions of men, women, and children persecuted for being Jewish were discriminated, hunted down, and eventually murdered. Some of these people escaped the final stage of destruction, and their experience of survival made them witnesses. In some cases, witnesses of the murder, as it happens for survivors of the concentration camps and mass shooting. In others, witnesses of perilous flights and precarious refuge. These experiences in their entirety define persecution as it took shape within the frame of nations that whose laws at one point singled out and attacked a portion of their citizens for on a religious or a racial basis. Many of those who survived, even in the most extreme conditions, experienced forms of humanity for which, as Primo Levi explained, they felt it was worth going back to life, even having experienced the horror of what a man can do to another man. On the backdrop of a collective crime that 80 decades later has yet to be fully absorbed by the societies in which it took place, that humanity became an anchor to which the survivors, as well as the people who surrounded them, hang on during the reconstruction of civil life, as well as through the process of memorialization of the experience of fascism, war, and persecution. While a great deal of intellectual energy has been dedicated to understanding what enabled the crimes and how they were committed, survival became the space for celebration of goodness, to express gratitude, to receive recognition, and to dispatch examples. Survivals have come to being identified primarily as rescue and salvation, as the act of courage and generosity bestowed by people who are usually non-Jewish to victims who are usually Jewish. Survival became much more prominently an object of social and political negotiation than an object of study. With the series of lectures that begin tonight, Centro Primo Levi seeks to nourish a space where survival can be understood and analyzed as an aspect of persecution and as a result of complex dynamics involving personal decisions, opportunities, and circumstances. Emancipating the reflection on survival from its celebratory frame has many consequences, which we will explore as we proceed in this semester through programs and publication. For tonight, I'd like to point to one element that has raised occasional debates, but that in fact I don't think has ever been explored in all its weight. The fact that relief that was carried out by Jews has largely remained in the background of history, while great prominence has been given to righteous Gentiles. So what have been defined by Yad Vashem. I would venture to say that organized Jewish relief all over Europe and with unimaginable efforts made by the Joint Distribution Committee in this country and led by individuals who worked humbly and against the odds and without pause, represents the platform on which all our help was given. In Italy, behind many of the stories of assistance to Jews involving partisans, clergy, officers, and civilians, certainly behind every organized effort were women and men who had joined an organization that various refugees committee and rescue committee that eventually converged in one organization called Delasim. They were all Jewish. And they attracted, they solicited, and they mobilized the help of many non-Jews. But this fundamental effort must be understood and must be appreciated not as a neat separation between Jews and non-Jews, in order to really understand, to have a sense of what persecution and survival meant. Tonight, we'll begin by discussing the life and actions of Angelo Donati, a prominent Jewish banker from Modena, who decided to take charge of Slim Possibilities and assist a large group of Jewish refugees. He did so with a degree of success that was not always what he had hoped, but I think he's a really good example of of actions taken within the Jewish world to escape persecution. We are very fortunate to have tonight with us Dr. Luca Fenoglio, who has written probably the only existing scholarly book on Donati, and he's a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. He received his PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh and has been a recipient of numerous scholarships from the Claims Conference, the Joint Distribution Committee, and Yad Vashem. He is the author of Angelo Donati, La questione ebraica nella Francia occupata dall'esercito italiano, The Jewish Question in occupied France, in France occupied by the Italian army, and What New Order, Fascist Expansionism and the Jews, the case of Southeastern France, 1942-1943, forthcoming. Is also the author of Between Protection and Complicity, Guido Lo Spinoso, Fascist Italy, and the Holocaust in Italian-occupied Southeastern France. His topic of study is the situation of the Jews in the south of France during the Italian occupation. Please welcome Luca Fenoglio. Because this is a very complicated story, we thought that we would organize it through some questions. So, welcome, Luca.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like, of course, to thank the Primo Levi Center, Natalia Endrimi, Alessandro Cassin for inviting me, the Italian Cultural Institute, of course, its director, and everyone here with us tonight. It's a pleasure and an honor, of course, but also a great responsibility. I hope to live up to expectations.
Okay, so we have, during many years of program, we've talked about situation in Italy, in the colonies, in the northeastern border, and where does this story take place, and when?
The Donati's story, as far as the Second World War is concerned, took place in southern France, especially on the Côte d'Azur, and in the city of Nice, so not far from the Italian border. That region, over the period of the war, that region was first officially free from Nazi occupation because it was included in the area of France that was handed over to the collaborationist government based in Vichy. This happened after the Nazi occupation and victory over France in the spring of 1940, and which in turn led to the armistice agreement between Germany and France on June 22, 1940. And like I said, so this map, what you can see from the map called free zone, so that area in blue remained under the direct authority of the Vichy government between June 22, 1940 until the Axis occupation of the region on November 11th, 1942. So Donati for 2 years was living under the authority of the Vichy government in a, like I said, in an officially free country in what was at the time largely Nazi-occupied Europe. But then, like I said, the second part, the one that in a way made Donati famous for his rescue activities, was the period of the 10-month period of the Italian occupation of southeastern France, that area that you see the green lines on the right side of the map. Donati was still based in Nice during the 10 months of the Italian occupation. The occupation, like I said, began on November 11th when the German and Italian armies marched into Vichy France, the Wehrmacht from the north, and whereas the Italian Fourth Army marched through from the east. And that area remained occupied by fascist Italy until the armistice agreement between Italy and the Allies that was signed on September the 3rd, 1943, was announced, so 5 days later, by General Dwight Eisenhower, so on September 8th. So that was the period, that was the time frame and the area where all these, the topic of tonight's talk happened.
So we are in southern France. Part is free zone, is ruled by the Vichy government, and part is under Italian occupation. Who was Angelo Donati?
Well, it's a very difficult question in a sense to answer. I don't know.
In simple terms, you know.
But especially after Mr. Meyer's very moving description of who Donati was, I'm not sure that I can offer a better answer. As a historian, I can try to briefly sketch his biography for you to explain how he happened to be in southern France and in Nice from July 1940, after the division of France, the northern part, as I said, occupied and directly ruled by the Nazis, and the southern part ruled directly by the Vichy government. Angelo Donati was born in Modena, as was mentioned, on February the 3rd, 1885. He had 6 brothers and 1 sister. His father was worked in the leather business, was a very successful businessman. Angelo grew up in Modena and also did his studies, attended college at the local university, and graduated in 1907 in law. And after that, however, he decided to move first to Turin and then to Milan, but to begin a career in finance. Of course, while he was in Milan, 1915 arrived, and 1915 was when Italy entered the First World War. Angelo was, of course, drafted in April 1915, about a month before Italy's official entry into the war in late May of that year. And he remained in the Italian army until the end of the war, 1918. But in that period, during the war, a major turning point in his life, as it would turn out, was happened in October 1916, when he was appointed to a military mission, an Italian military mission to Paris. So early 1917, he moved to Paris, working as a liaison officer between the Italian army and the French armies. And I said that was a turning point in his biography, and it's crucial then to understand the following story, because when he was discharged from the army in late 1918, after the war had ended, he decided to remain in Paris and settle in Paris. And if you want, I think we historians tend to find pivotal moments and in chronology and dates, and in a way that moment was another turning point, his decision to remain in Paris, because there began the Angelo Donati that Mr. Meyer was describing. He soon became a very successful businessman. He was the CEO of a number of very successful enterprises. He also was a shareholder of other enterprises. And he began his ascent in Paris high society. And another pivotal moment here was 1925, when he was appointed General Consul of the Republic of San Marino. At that point, he had already become acquainted with a number of prominent figures, Italian and French political, but also personalities in the world of finance. By that time, it had also helped create and found a new bank, the Italian-French Credit Bank, of which he then became director and then CEO, and which also later, when he was in Nice during the war period, gave him an office and a place to continue and his activities, not only of relief and rescue activities, but also his business and professional activities. And to quickly move to the next step. So after he remained a consul until 1933. Then when he decided to resign, to resign from the post, we don't really know why, or at least I wasn't able to find the reason why. But the following year, 1934, a new important appointment came in his direction. He was appointed president of the Italian Chamber of Commerce in Paris. Upon the appointment was suggested and favored by the then Italian ambassador, Bonifacio Pignatti Morano di Custoso, was also a native of Modena. Probably this connection played a role. But at the time, Angelo Donati was already a key figure of the Italian colony in Paris, a very munificent one. Was extremely generous. But then probably I'm going too far.
So this man is, come from this prominent family in Modena. They're extremely integrated. All his brothers are in different fields of the Italian public life. He's a diplomat. He's a banker. He's a businessman. He lives somewhat marginal to the Italian reality. I mean, in Italy, by 1934, fascism is has fully unraveled in the country. Since 1924, I mean, so it's 10 years of dictatorship. But he lives somewhat outside in France, where also the few Italian anti-fascists had moved after the murder of Giacomo Matteotti in 1924. So what was Donati's relation? I mean, this is a question that will take on which we cannot really expand. But what was his relationship with the regime?
Well, it's a tricky question from a historical point of view. Of course, like I said, Donati through the 1920s and the same through the 1930s became a prominent figure in the Italian colony in Paris. This, of course, meant to be acquainted, be in very good relationship with both the Italian ambassadors in Paris, but also the Italian general consuls. Like I said, he was a very munificent, very generous member of the Italian colony. He helped for instance, to bring poor Italian kids from Paris to Italy in the summer. He paid for the travel and for their stay in colonies in Italy for them to enjoy the summer, and a number of other generous gifts he gave to the Italian colony. This to say that, of course, he was in touch with the representatives of what at the time was Fascist Italy, and so to a certain extent he was close to Fascist Italy, and probably also had to come to terms one way or another with the fact that in order to do business with these people, he had to accept the state of affairs. On the other hand, this is perhaps a little known story, precisely because of his importance in that context. In the early 1930s, it was twice investigated by the fascist political police, who accused him of actually behind this facade of a proper fascist, proper Italian abroad, actually of colluding with the Italian anti-fascist, the anti-fascist concentration. More specifically, the political police accused him of being the mastermind of the finances of the, because of course, I mean, it made sense. He was a banker after all. But in my researches, I didn't find any proof, and actually these inquiries eventually ended up in nothing. So to give you an answer, it's very difficult to say what the relationship with the regime was. Certainly, Donati was a man very close to the institutions. At the time, these institutions were those of a dictatorship.
Yeah, although we know that some of his brothers were definitely allied on the anti-fascist side, and some definitely allied on the regime side. Just a quick, before we arrive to the heart of the story, Donati also had ties to Zionism, to the Zionist movement.
Yes, here again, I in my research, which was mostly focused on what Donati did in southern France during the period of the Italian occupation on behalf of Jewish refugees, I only marginally investigated into this aspect. But yes, we know that Donati knew Chaim Weizmann, the future first president of the State of Israel, and in 1922, as a historian Sergio Binerbi documented in a volume, Angelo Donati organized a meeting between Weizmann and the Italian and the Apostolic Nuncio in Paris. In 1931, he was also briefly in touch with Vladimir Jabotinsky, a very important Zionist leader. It was apparently, in that case, was Jabotinsky who approached Donati. At the time, Jabotinsky was trying to establish a relationship and a possible alliance with the fascist regime, and so he thought that Donati might help in that direction. But in one of the documents that I found in Yad Vashem, the archives in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, I also found that Donati was involved in the creation of Kerem Hayesod. I apologize for my very bad pronunciation. Was the Palestine Fund that was founded in the early 1920s, and I haven't found yet documentary proof of the type of involvement of his involvement is in this enterprise, but it was probably at the time again that he met with Jabotinsky, who was one of the founder also of this organization. So yes, certainly he was involved in the Zionist cause to one extent or another, but this is very much something that would be very interesting to look into with more depth.
So is this very worldly figure, he is a benefactor of many different causes. He lives between many different worlds. And 1938, 8 years ago, in October, the racial laws are promulgated by Mussolini's regime and the King of Italy. And the Jews in Italy are stripped of their civil rights, while foreign Jews are expelled. Suddenly, the situation of the Jews with public position lose their post. Jews who have business lose their business. Businesses are seized. Contacts and relations with non-Jews are prohibited. Jews are eliminated from any public space of society. What happens to Donati?
Well,
he's in France.
It was in Paris when the anti-Jewish campaign was launched, starting from the summer of 1938, and then getting full motion in the second half.
Well, they were very efficient because the census is done
Yes,
beforehand.
yes.
So by the time it's October, Jews are identified either through the list of the Falco Law as well as through informers. I mean, the Italian police is deployed to identify all the Jews in the country and apply the law.
So when throughout all this process, Donati was in Paris and was, we must assume that was informed what was going on through family, friends, relatives.
Also, he held a public
moreover
position, an official position.
And but because he was in Paris, he couldn't really be reached, in a sense, from the Russian laws. Of course, only, again, there is an exception. At the time, like I said, since 1934, he was the president of the Italian Chamber of Commerce. And of course, as an Italian Jew, he was asked, not to say forced, to step down and resign, which he did on December the 1st, 1938. But in a way, since this was the only direct, if you want, connection, professional connection with fascist Italy at the time, he, in a way, was spared from all the other measures, which also involved, of course, seizing the properties of wealthy Jews. But since his wealth was mostly, or almost entirely, in France, he was shielded from this kind of measures. Now, this, if we think in terms of, if you want, practical terms, it's of course more difficult to say what his reaction to the Russian laws was. Or at least I, wasn't unable to locate any memoirs or diaries. However, knowing that he fought during World War I, knowing what it did for Italy, not only fascist Italy, but for Italy, for Italians in Paris, we can assume, I would say safely assume, that it was, of course, he felt betrayed and, of course, was bewildered, to say the least, by these, to a certain extent, unexpected turn by the regime. And this can be clearly seen from the memorandum that he prepared to apply for discrimination, what was called discrimination, which the name is very misleading because the Russian laws allowed Jews who had certain merits toward Italy or the regime to apply for minor exemptions from the laws themselves, and he applied in 1938. No, actually, in the spring of 1939, and then eventually got it. And from the memorandum that he wrote, he, at the very beginning, at the incipit, he said clearly that since he had no personal interest of economic or any other interest in Italy, he was applying and submitting that request only out of ideal motives. And in a way that I think that reference to ideal motives indicates is, again, his feeling of, his sense of betrayal from, not only from fascism, but from Italy, from the king, of course, who signed, as we all know, those infamous racial laws.
So, during the racial laws, during the promulgation of the racial laws and the year and a half that unfolded, really, 1938 and 1939 were the years in which the laws begin to be applied and really change the face of social life for Jews in Italy. 15,000 Jews are expelled and actually leave the country. I mean, it's and then in a very short time, by June 1940, whoever had remained, who had lost their citizenship or was a foreigner, were arrested and interned in a very systematic, very brutal way. So all this scene in Italy is something that Donati doesn't really live through, although he has family in Italy, he must have heard. But also in France, things change. France is...
Well, yes, so let's say that the period 1939, looking in hindsight, looks like a sort of a short transition period from one bad news to the other, if I put it in this way. In 1937, Angelo Donati remarried. He had first married in the early 1920s, but then his first wife died in 1929 in a car accident. He then remarried in 1937 in Tunis. Again, the Italian political police got an interest in his second marriage, mostly because his second wife was some 15 years younger than him, and at the time that was considered not to be a good thing. So there are reports also and requests of information to the consul in Tunis to know what was going on in Rome. They wanted to, but it was a very brief and inconclusive investigation. But why did I mention this? Because 1938, terrible moment for Italian Jews and foreign Jews who lived in Italy and who, for a number of years, especially after 1933, many of them had found a refuge in Italy, as Klaus Vogt showed in a very important book now published more than 20 years ago. And so Donati was in France. Like I said, he resigned from the Chamber of Commerce, but kept living his life as he did before. He still was Angelo Donati, he still was a prominent figure, he still had his connections, he still had his professional status, his wealth. But as we all know, 1939 is when World War II began, although often here in the States, people think it only began in 1941, but in Europe it began a little earlier. And so September the 1st, 1941, Nazi Germany, Hitler, invaded Poland. 2 days later, 39, and then 2 days later, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany, and that was the beginning of World War II. And a few months before, I was unable to find a specific moment. A few months before this happened, Donati had realized that things were getting worse and worse. And so he decided to send his second wife and the children of her to the States here. They came here, and after the war, they Donati and her divorced, and then she remained here in the States. But again, 1939, we know after the takeover of Poland and then the division of Poland between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, nothing really happened. If you want, the war, the real war, began at least on the Western Front only on May 10th, 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded the Low Countries and then swiftly, very quickly, took over France. And so now we are in June 1940, and it's at this moment that things got, of course, even worse for Donati. The French army was very quickly defeated. The British army is also withdrawing and trying to make it back into the British Isles. And the French people are basically left alone. And Donati, with the Wehrmacht, the German army, advancing towards Paris, where the Germans arrived on June 14th, decided to flee, to escape, like many others, thousands of people, of refugees. And here I was able to trace, at least find some of the steps of Donati's flight from Paris to Nice in the summer of 1940. Yes, first he went, of course, from Paris. He left and went to Brive-la-Gaillarde, and then went down to the border, French-Spanish border.
Let's try to arrive to the moment.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we know that on June 18th he was in Cauterets. I assume, because I don't know with any certainty, that he was possibly thinking of crossing, or even trying to cross the border and maybe reach Portugal and flee, like many others did. But possibly also because of the decision by the French government to reach a settlement, let's say, with the Nazis, would then lead to the armistice of June the 22nd. Donati changed his mind, and so from Cauterets he moved to the Côte d'Azur. He first arrived in Cannes, and then eventually settled in Nice, where, like I said, there was this other branch of the bank that he had founded 20 years before, and that where he installed himself, as the Italian consul said.
So at this point, we have Donati is fleeing Paris, is fleeing German-occupied France. He could go come probably to the United States through Portugal, as many refugees did. He changes his mind, and he settles in Nice, where this story takes place. There are Jews in Nice.
Yes, like I said, I mean, at that point there were many people, not only Jews. I mean, many French took the same route that Donati took in that summer, like Mr. Meyer, trying to flee, trying to escape the Nazis. Of course, after the Kristallnacht, November 1938, Jews had, if you want, an additional motive to be afraid of the Nazis, and Donati was, I suspect, was one of those. But when he arrived in Nice, yes, he immediately managed to reestablish all his connections. We know that because the then Italian General Consul in Nice, Silvio Camerani, reported twice about Donati and his connections, the Jewish milieu that were on the Côte d'Azur. And we know that Donati immediately, again, rebuilt immediately his network. Many of his friends from Paris were also in Cannes, in Nice, and the other cities, in Monaco. And we also know that many looked at him in those first months after the armistice, when nobody really knew what was going to happen, how long this situation was going to last. Many were hoping, actually many did get back to Paris, for instance. And Donati was one of them, also because he had some unfinished business on the professional side in Paris, and many trusted him to settle their matters.
Can I,
Of course.
He nurtured his relationship with the Italian military attaché during the 30s, who was actually Mussolini's representative. That relationship persisted, and very little of it is made, but it gave him some protection to do certain things early on. In the occupied part of France after Vichy was still ruled. We lived in the Auvergne region, my brother and I, with cousins who were French. We were Germans, obviously. And he had my uncle Sally Meyer, who was his brother-in-law, original brother-in-law, and asked him to try to get us out of France, my brother and I. And he had the clout, which was in Vichy, France. Somebody came to this village where we lived and said, Sally Meyer is providing for you to get to Switzerland. We did not trust that person. We thought that person was trying to rope us in. But it was Donati that basically had the contacts in France, which Sally Meyer didn't have. So he kept connections. But the story is that he was close to the Italian military attaché in Paris for a long time. Whether that person helped in his later life.
Well, actually, if I because eventually his plan of going back to Paris to settle his businesses and some of his clients, eventually he decided not to go. And this because, again, Camerani reported to Rome that apparently Donati went to visit him at the General Consulate in Nice, explaining him his plan to go back to Paris, possibly also asking for advice or even safe conduct. After all, Italy was Nazi Germany's chief ally. And Camerani suggested that it doesn't do that unless he clearly had written on his passport, because immediately after the country was divided, that demarcation line between the northern part directly ruled by the Nazis and the southern part ruled by Vichy became effectively a border. So you needed a passport or at least official papers to cross it. And this was like this actually throughout the whole period of the German occupation until the summer of 44. So Camerani suggested to Donati that he should have asked to have written on his papers that actually he was Jewish. And probably Donati at that point realized that that wasn't going to be a good idea. But to confirm your memory, yes, Camerani also mentioned that somehow someone from the consulate in Paris, so probably the military attaché, had managed to get him a safe conduct, but without mentioning is yes. And what Camerani defined it is quality. Yes.
So we get to 1942. Many refugees and many Jewish refugees flee to the south of France. There are a few relief committees. The Joint Distribution Committee had actually posts in port areas since 1938. There are all these refugees. Donati decides to join the efforts, the relief efforts. What happens?
Well, we have to take a step back. Of course, let's say that the first, after the first few months, couple of months after, 3-4 months after the new France is established, again, it's a period where nobody really knows what's going to happen. But for the several thousand Jews, hundreds of thousands Jews who lived in France at the time, and particularly those who lived
350,000 Jews
in Vichy France, things became worse already on October the 3rd, 1940, when the first statute on Jews was issued by the Vichy government. That was the official beginning of the anti-Jewish persecution in France by the Vichy government. It was an autonomous decision. The Nazis weren't involved in any way, although they had, by the time, already begun their own anti-Jewish persecution in the occupied zone. But until the summer of 1942, the Jews who lived in Vichy France, so Donati among them, only, if I can put it in this way, only had to endure the persecution. But as we know, starting in 1941, after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, at that point, what the Nazis called the final solution of the Jewish question, policy of systematic extermination of European Jews, had begun. So in a way, there was a chronological mismatch, if you want. So while in Central and Eastern Europe, the extermination was already going on, especially starting then going in full motion after starting the spring of 1942. In Vichy France, at that moment, Jews like Donati had not been directly under threat of the Nazis.
Life we're talking. I mean,
yes.
Italy applied racial laws in 1938. They were very devastating. France in 1940, they are very devastating. They destroyed the social life of Jews, but not their physical. It's not yet.
Absolutely, no. Jews had to endure social discrimination, professional discrimination. They had a very hard time getting by. That was for sure. But in Nazi-occupied Europe, the persecution had already taken a different face to it, and had already turned into systematic mass murder. I say this because in order to understand what Donati did for his co-religionists during the period of the Italian occupation between November 1942 and September 1943, we have to, like I said, take a step back and think what happened in France in the summer of 1942, both in the German-occupied zone and the Vichy ruled areas. Because after the Nazi extermination campaign had begun in Eastern Europe, Poland, and the former Soviet occupied territories, after the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, the Nazis turned their attention also to Western Europe. And France, of course, hosted several 100,000 Jews. And two pivotal moments. That I should also mention that the first deportation train left France in March 1942. But the real turning point in France was the summer of 1942. First, in July, mid-July 1942, the infamous roundup of the Velodrome d'Ivry. And after having raided several thousand Jews in the occupied zone, the Nazis turned, at that point, the attention to Vichy France, where, again, Jews had been enduring a ruthless persecution, had been living in a very difficult condition, and condition kept worsening because after the first statute on Jews, Vichy issued a second one in June 1941, and then in July 1941 started also chasing Jews' properties, and Donati was also personally affected by this form of legalized stealing from the Vichy government. But in August, and at the end of August 1942, like I said, the Nazis, they reached the deal with the French police and saw a second roundup all across what at that point was still the so-called free zone or an occupied zone, was carried out by French police, and thousands of Jews again were arrested, concentrated in police stations, improvised camps, any places where they could put them, and then shipped first to the French at the time still French-run concentration camp of Drancy, which is north of Paris, which was the point where the vast majority of the deportation trains from France left to Auschwitz.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that point was a pivotal moment for Donati because, of course, the roundup in the unoccupied zone was also carried out in Nice. And although Donati was not directly threatened by the roundup because it was Italian, so the French police was hunting down only certain nationalities, he was a witness. And actually, it was at the very time that he rescued the two little children, youngsters, the Speer, who then, after the war, he adopted, and Marianne and Rolf.
Yeah, can you just say something about the different nationalities? I mean, there are French Jews, foreign Jews. There are many refugees at this point. There are Polish Jews, German Jews, many stateless Jews who are in the south of France.
Yes, at that point, of course, Jews tried to escape, of course. And many of them, especially during 1942, when the persecution became something else, became deportation, became being arrested and shipped to places unknown, to an unknown destiny, of course, decided to and tried to escape. And so, if you want, a third wave of Jewish refugees arrived starting the 1942, the first months of 1942, and these were mostly from the Netherlands and Belgium, and of course the northern part of France, the one occupied directly by the Germans. But very often these Jews were in Belgium, were in the Netherlands, but they actually were originally from other countries, Central and Eastern Europe, families, single men, single women who had escaped first Nazi deportation, starting in 1933, and then when it was still possible after the first months of the war. And so what happened in southern France, but actually was the same thing throughout the unoccupied zone, you really had a mosaic of nationalities. You have, of course, the French Jews, but you had Italian Jews, in fact, a tiny minority. And then you had Jews from all over Europe. And, of course, you had also stateless Jews.
So
Jews
what happens, I mean, what are the measures that are taken against the different groups of Jews?
Well, like I said, in the summer of in the summer of 1942, when the Nazis and the Vichy police reached that agreement and decide to carry out a vast roundup of Jews, they the only problem is to decide who to include in the roundup. And at the time, and actually it was like that almost through the end of the occupation, the Vichy government was completely uninterested in the fate of foreign Jews, whatever their nationality was, but they wanted to, I don't want to use protect, but they didn't want to give in French Jews. Not so much because they cared about them personally or even collectively, but mostly as a form of national pride. They wanted to defend the prestige and the diplomatic and political prestige of France. Please.
In July 1942, Vichy issued a decree removing French citizenship from Romanian and Polish Jews that had come to France during the 20s. And for instance, we were in Vichy. My family was French. We lived with my family. We were kids. My brother and I were 13 and 11, no, 12 and 14. And we were given an order to leave Vichy within 24 hours because we were stateless Jews. And this applied to even former French citizens whose citizenship was removed. This happened in July 42. There were some people in the French government, like Flandin and some others, that had been ministers in the 30s, that resisted the move, obviously. But there were some very anti-Semitic people in the French government. And Pétain, some people thought that Pétain wanted to resist it, but he was an old man, he was okay. And because he had a companion in Verdun that was Jewish. And so, but it didn't work. So we had to leave Vichy in 24 hours, as a lot of other Jews. Vichy was the resort for France, for the kings and queens, and had hotels all over, and the hotels were full of Jews. I mean, they had a small synagogue on Friday nights and Saturday. People stood outside. Jews from everywhere, Eastern Europe, okay? So, eventually we had to leave Vichy also. So, anyhow, didn't mean to interrupt that.
No. But these of nationalities, we discussed this many times. It's a very complicated matter, but here the point that is important is that eventually, as part of the deal, the first batch, if you want, of Jews that Vichy had to provide to the Nazis were those who were originally from what at the time was Nazi-occupied Europe. So all the states that the Nazis were ruling directly at the time. So of course there was all Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, but also much of Southeastern Europe, because in April 1941, the German army had invaded the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and had taken over all the old Balkans down to Greece, also in April 1941. So basically, all the Europe from Germany to almost the Urals was under German occupation. So all Jews from those countries. And of course, when we mention stateless, they weren't really stateless. They were, or officially, they were more often now, they were former German Jews who had been stripped of their citizenship once they had managed to emigrate, often legally, in the period of the persecution.
This happened in Italy in the same
yes,
way.
Yes, absolutely. But at the time, other nationalities were protected. Again, Italian Jews. At the time, the fascist government that was still persecuting and interning Jews in Italy, nonetheless opposed the deportation of Italian Jews. At the same time, also though opposing the repatriation of Italian Jews. So this was the very complex situation.
So where are the Italians at this point?
Well, after the roundup of August 1942, everything changed. Also, Jews, all Jews, French Jews included, although for them it took a little longer to realize that, because again they thought, we are French, our government won't allow anything to happen to us. What happened? The scenario changed drastically, and of course, when on November 11th, the at the time former unoccupied zone became also occupied by the Nazis and the Italians, who took over the region here from the French-Italian border to the Rhone, east of the Rhone. What happened was that many, of course, were scared, but many others were also happy because they had somehow ended up in the areas occupied by the Italians. In fact, the Italians were not as good as they often are portrayed. At the time, they weren't. They weren't.
What happened? Sorry, what happened? So the Italian occupation expands. What happens? There are Jews from all over. There have been roundups. There are refugees. There are several committees of relief, of Jewish relief, that are more or less loosely connected to the Joint and to Italian as well as to Italian organizations. I mean, there is a vast network of Jewish relief. What happens? What is the situation of the Jews in the Italian occupied? Just try to reach the Italian occupied area because it seems safer. It is said to be safer. People think that they can have a moment of a respite at that point. What happens?
Well, like you said, initially Jews don't really know what was going to happen. But a pivotal moment is again in December 1942 when in Nice the French prefect, issues a decree that says that in 72 hours, a number of foreign Jews have to be evacuated to areas occupied by the Germans. It was just a way to hand them over. At that point, however, the area was occupied by the Italians, and of course Nice was one of those regions that fascism wanted to re-annex. And so what happened, the Italian government and also the armed forces opposed that decree and forced the Vichy government to withdraw the expulsion order. So effectively, they saved some 1,400 Jews who were concerned by this evacuation order. Immediately, of course, at that point, word spread out outside of the Italian occupation zone, that the Italians were protecting the Jews because effectively they were, although their motivations are not always as noble as our historians sometimes describe them. But what happened? So a real exodus, as it is described in the documents of the Jewish relief by the time also rescue organizations, tell us an exodus of Jews from the German occupied areas began because, of course, at that point in the German occupied areas, the extermination was in full swing. Germans were constantly rounding up Jews, carrying out arrests, and the French police kept helping them. And so Jews, all the Jews who were in the Italian occupation zone were in danger of, in the German occupation zone, were in danger of being arrested and deported. And
what happens in the Italian occupation?
But what happens in the Italian occupation is, like I said, there is this opposition to the French measures. And here is when Angelo Donati comes back into the picture, and in a very important and prominent way, because when he heard that the French prefect had issued this order for these foreign Jews to be expelled in 72 hours to a German occupation zone, he immediately went to talk to what he called in his post-war testimony his personal friend, Alberto Calisse, who was at the time the Italian general consul in Nice. And according to what Donati tells us, they took immediately two decisions. The first decision was to issue papers to all the Jews that Donati was able to bring to the consulate, saying, we, the Italian authorities, need you here because you are under our authority, and effectively this shielded the Jews who had this piece of paper, which was mostly devoid of any real official value, but they were effectively shielded. And the second thing was that Donati decided, so he says, with the consul to send a telegram to Rome denouncing the French measure. Now, here the story gets a little complicated for us to go into now, but what happened is that this dispatch was really sent to Rome, but it didn't really say what Donati thought it said. But what's important here is that the answer that arrived from Rome, like I said, was positive. In fact, Rome, in particular the foreign ministry, said to Calisse, do not allow the French to carry out the measure. And Donati at that point came to believe or to think, or was convinced at that point, that the Italians were effectively ready to protect them, and that somehow he had been a certain degree of involvement in this process. And this was very much the beginning of Donati's action in favor of the Jews, because then the second part of the story.
He made a plan.
Yes. There is another small detail in the middle before we get to the plan. I hope you don't mind if I what happened is that the Italians, in early December, before the French prefect issued that order, had decided, Mussolini himself had decided that all Jews had to be interned because the Italians considered Jews a security threat. Of course, Donati, the Jews didn't know that. And when the internment operation began after Rome had decided to stop the French Jews, Donati and many others interpreted that internment process, which was originally in its intention a security measure, and if you want also an anti-Jewish measure.
Well, the persecution measure.
They interpreted it as a form of protection. And so what happened was that Donati, through the intermediacy of Calisse, was then involved in organizing this process of internment. And here I have a map here of the cities that the small towns where Jews were sent. The ones circled in red were chosen in the first phase of the internment process, so roughly between late February and early April 1943, and then the one circled in yellow up in the Haute-Savoie department, where the small villages where Jews were sent, starting from April through mid-August 1943, when the operation stopped. So Donati played a key role here, because we know that the police officer who actually worked for the Italian political police, so far from being a nice guy, nonetheless, his name was Rosario Barranco. When he had a number of other tasks, so he decided to somehow hand it over to Donati to pick the localities where to send the Jews, or somehow to consult him. So again, Donati then was part of this process. Not only that, through another committee, this famous Comité de Bouchage, which was based in Nice, Donati and the committee became involved in all this process and somehow helped the Italians in carrying out what was, like I said, in its intention, anti-Jewish measure, but the Jews perceived as saving measure, as even a rescue measure.
I mean, you also Jews lived day by day. I mean, today being interned in a camp was a little better than being at large and at the risk of being caught by the Germans. So
no, absolutely.
And I mean, on the other border, Jews actually paid the army. Wealthy Jews from Yugoslavia paid the army to be interned, to be then deported. But
no, my comment was mostly to give you an example of the complexity of the situation and of how Jews sometimes had to make very difficult decisions, and it wasn't so much of better and worse, but of worse and even worse.
What is okay until tomorrow.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So Jews are interned, and at this point, Donati thinks he has a relationship with the Italian authorities. In truth, as you have demonstrated in the book, they don't really disclose the entire story. So, but he has a plan and he tries to carry it out. What is the plan?
Well, first of all, Donati was a man used to talk and be in relationship with the Italian authorities. So from his point of view, if you look at things from his point of view, this collaboration that began with Barranco, with Calise, and with other authorities, both civilian and military authorities, wasn't really anything new to him. He just kept being Donati, and an important man, a well-respected man, a wealthy man, also a very generous man. Again, we know from reports from Jewish organizations that he spent a lot of time and money and efforts to help refugees who were in distress and were living a very difficult time. But Donati was also a smart man, and his connections didn't stop at the border. He had connections in Rome since, like I said, the early 20s, when he founded when the Italian government chose him to found the Italian-French Credit Bank in Paris. So he and many others realized that all that situation of this division of the country between the Germans and the Italians, but also the French were there, and nobody really knew who was ruling at that point, because the French said one thing and then the Italians arrived and said, no, you cannot do this, and we only managed the Jews here. So there was a great degree of uncertainty, because if we take a step back and look at the larger picture, at that point, we are in the spring of 1943, the Axis is losing the war. The reason why the German and Italian armies invaded southern France and the unoccupied zone was because 3 days earlier, so the invasion was November 11th, on November 8th, the Allied, but mostly a major American expedition force had landed in French Morocco and Algeria. At that point, a new front was opened, because at that point, also Southern Europe could become a new point of landing for the Allies. So if we move forward to the spring of 1943, in particular May 1943, at that point in May 1943, the Allied had managed to conquer all Africa and to kick out from Africa the Axis forces. And also on the Eastern Front, after the defeat in Stalingrad in February, the Nazis were withdrawing. So what's going on? The Axis are losing the war, and from Donati's point of view, of course, this is a very good thing, but on the other hand, there is the risk that since Italy is the weak element in the Axis ally, the Italian government decides to withdraw its army from France to defend the Italian coast, thus leaving hundreds of, actually thousands of Jews into the hands of the Nazis. So Donati had this plan. He thought, why don't we move all the Jews to Italy? Why did he thought that? Because I think two reasons maybe. First of all, he didn't have any other options where to send them at that point, but also because at that point he really thought that the Italians were somehow ready to help them, to help him. So starting certainly after the Allied landings in Sicily on July 10th, he began to travel to Rome and to talk especially to officials in the foreign ministry. In particular, he mentions this official, Luigi Vidal, who was a high-ranking diplomat, trying to convince them to open the gates, open the doors, and let these Jews to enter Italy and what looked at that point a safe haven, or at least safer than southern France. Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, the Italian government denied entry to these Jews. And this also after Mussolini fell, he was arrested on July the 25th, and a new government was created, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio. But even after that pivotal moment, on August the 23rd, the Italian government clearly said, no, I'm not going to let these Jews in. So at that point, Donati had another idea, even more desperate to a certain extent, but also even more ambitious, since, like I said, North Africa was freed by then. It was in the hands of the Allies. He hoped to move this mass of people. It's very difficult to quantify, possibly, let's say, between 20 and possibly even 40,000 people to North Africa. But now we are already into August 1943, and like I said, at this moment, the new government is already negotiating with the Allies for an armistice, trying to get out of the war with the wishful thinking that the Germans would allow them to do that. So in this very extremely complicated situation, Donati started going back and forth with Nice. He even managed to get to Pope Pius XII through a friend, a collaborator of his, Father Marie Benoit. We don't have time to go into that. Susan
We have
Zuccot
presented the program about
Yeah.
him, and he was very involved in Jewish rescue.
And so at the end of August, we are August 28th, so merely 10 days before the announcement of the armistice agreement, he managed to get the approval of the Italian government to this plan. And at that point, through the intermediacy of Pierre Petel, the Father Benoit, and others, he also managed to get in touch in the Vatican with the British and American representatives, Sir Francis Osborne and Harold H. Titman, who at that point were also sending cables to DC and to London, trying to get some support. At that point, there was another player that we didn't mention, but it was very important. Actually, you mentioned it before. The Joint was also involved. Donati was in touch with Jules, aka Dika Jefroiking, was the not the only one, but the most important representative of the Joint in southern France, trying to get the funding in order to get a loan and get some ships, of course, to send these Jews. And so in this period of 4 or 5 weeks, Donati was continually moving back and forth from Nice to Rome, trying to convince, trying to triangulate a number of institutions and governments. But unfortunately, his plan was unsuccessful. He was caught by surprise by actually almost all Italy. and the Italian army abroad, and many Jews who at that point still counted on Italian protection. By the armistice agreement, he was in Florence when Eisenhower announced the agreement, and at that point a different story began, because for Donati, I mean, he then managed to escape to Switzerland. Before that, he sent his future adoptive children and his butler to Liguria, not far actually from Nice, and sent them into hiding. But again, this is a different story. But it was, unfortunately, his plan didn't go as he hoped for. But nonetheless, he managed to save many Jews who were in the Italian zone, because they were concentrated in Nice and were able in Nice to get into hiding and then disperse again and somehow survive the war.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that there is maybe a point in this plan. We don't have much time, so we're going to close and then open the floor for questions. Just to give a little map, while Donati is carrying out this desperate attempt, he contacts people. What you show very well in the book is that what people tell him, whether it's the Italian authority, the Vatican, the Americans, is not quite what it is. And the plan falls apart for lack of coordination, but also for lack of intention. The armistice is underway, the negotiation for the armistice is underway. There is no concern for what will happen to the Jews. Clearly, everybody knows. The Joint is very worried. They make contact with the authorities. They're very worried about what will happen to the Jews in Italy. But none of the parties involved are concerned about it, to take the matter seriously, and the deportation begins immediately after in fact begins a week after the armistice in the north, and then in October in Rome and the rest of Italy. So while he's trying to bring people into Italy, he has no sense that the same thing is going to happen south. This is just this is one man trying to deal with great powers, and in a way it is truly admirable. In another way, we see how little people were able to do, because there was no, the rescue of Jews was really not a central matter in the way in which we want to make it today. It was, in fact, extremely marginal, and most powers that be had no real interest in it. So I think that this story really puts the spotlight on this. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. I'm sure there are some, and we'll take maybe 5 or 6, and then we'll continue in the next sessions.
Obviously, the family likes to sometimes exaggerate their family member's role. But there's been a story that basically Store Meyer, who was his nephew, has touted, and that actually Donati had communicated with the Italian general in charge of the area around Grenoble, and basically the Italian general told the Vichy police that they didn't have jurisdiction, that the jurisdiction was with the Italian military, and saved quite a few Jews in that particular area. In your research, can you give credence to that?
Well, the general framework is true, in the sense that when in December 1942 the Foreign Ministry and the Supreme Command of the Italian Armed Forces order the Italian authorities on the ground to oppose the French prefect's evacuation order to expel those 1,400 Jews to German-occupied areas. They not only say they cannot do that, they say all matters concerning Jews of any nationalities, so Italian, French, all nationalities, are laying the exclusive competence of the Italian occupation authorities. So at that point, effectively, Rome says the Vichy government cannot carry out any anti-Jewish measure of whatever kind. In fact, that's not really true, because we know that the so-called Arianisation, so the process of expropriation of Jewish properties carried out with very smoothly. And actually, the Italian either didn't pay attention or didn't. I think they knew, they just didn't care. That was a minor issue. So, of course, Rome sent the orders to Menton, which was the seat of the Italian Fourth Army Command, and to Nice, which was the most important consulate in that area. But there was, of course, yes, also Grenoble. And then from there, it went down the chain of command. And so there are episodes throughout the Italian occupation zone of the Italian authorities opposing arrests, opposing, sometimes just preventing French police from asking questions, or mostly harassing Jews. So yes, that certainly happened. We have the documents of the different commanders sending formal letters to the prefects of other French authorities saying, from now on, you don't meddle in Jewish matters here. We are the masters in that respect. Whether or not it was Donati who sent the message, or I don't know. It might be, or possibly not. I mean, he certainly played a role from Nice of constantly reminding, if you want, the authorities that things were happening, or soliciting and asking. Again, I think this is very interesting. Often, it's in the historiography has been portrayed as a sign of his power. To me, it was mostly a sign of how he perceived the situation, how, despite the fact fascist Italy was an anti-Semitic country, was a country that persecuted Jews, ruined Jewish lives in Italy and abroad, nonetheless, he still thought that it was Donati, and this new situation didn't really affect his status. And so he kept acting, and to a certain extent he was right, as he did before. He still thought, still understood himself as someone who could go and ask and also obtain. And so there is this interesting dynamic. Whether or not then the Italian authorities did or obliged him, it's another matter. But it's also very difficult to document in many ways.
My mother came to this country from Switzerland before World War II. Subsequently, I visited family in Lausanne, Switzerland, her aunt and other people. I had always thought that Switzerland was a neutral country. This is what I was taught. I heard the other side. The family was persecuted, their monies were taken, their livelihood, and this is not well known in any of the literature that one might come across. Do you want to address that, please?
Yes, I mean, in this case, I must say you probably know more than I do, in the sense that in my research, I haven't dealt with the specific case of Switzerland, so I cannot really agree or disagree with your point. I also read that that the narrative of promoted by Switzerland after the war was, of course, embellished, and that's certainly a fact. We know, I mean, what I can tell about the Swiss government and authorities' attitude towards Jews, relates to what happened at the French-Swiss border during the period of the Italian occupation, because of course many refugees tried, not only Jews, but of course a huge amount of Jews tried to find a safe haven in Switzerland. And of course the Italians, and here again goes against the narrative of the good Italians who protected the Jews, they protected the Jews insofar as they didn't let the French do anything to them, but on the other hand, they didn't let them, for instance, cross the French-Swiss border. And so we know, we have the documents, they arrested many families, often with children, lone women with children, who were trying to escape, and they arrested them. In some cases, they also handed them over to the French police. But not only the Italians tried to stop these efforts to escape, also the Swiss police, when they arrested, when they caught people in the act of crossing the border, what they did, they just took them back and handed them over either to the French police or to the Italian police. So this is all that I can say about Switzerland.
Yeah, Switzerland will be the next program.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like you to comment a little bit about the sources of your research and how easy is it to access the sources of research, being Italian, French, or United Nations. Can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you. In the sources that I used for my book on Donati were mostly from the Italian archives and French archives. It was easy to access them. Thankfully, again, one should make certain distinctions, especially when it comes to Italian archives. The archives of the Italian army are accessible, but they don't make it really easy for you to work there for a number of restrictions on the days you can get to the archives, and working hours, sometimes only 2-3 hours per day. So especially when one doesn't live in Rome, as most of scholars do, it gets complicated for expensive time, etc. But in general, it's not really difficult. In France, archives, France has a different policy. Archives concerning the black years, the dark years, as they call them, of the Vichy period are very easily accessible. They already in the 70s and 80s they made microfilms and microfiches in order to preserve the originals. But so it's absolutely anyone can access those archives. It's free, and you know also in terms of the hours the archives are open. So that's very easy. And as far as the States, for instance, it's also pretty easy. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is a state-of-the-art archive. It's really a gem for historians.
But the Vatican archive, are they accessible?
The period for the war, not yet, no.
So we had a question there, then here, and then here. Let's start there.
I have a question about whether you know about any debates among the Jews who were interned at Donati's urging in these various camps. Lorenzo de Felice said many years ago that internment put the internees at risk of deportation, and whether they were aware of these risks and whether there was resistance to the idea among them.
Again, it's very difficult to answer your question, which is a very good question, but we don't really have the documents that tell us what the decision-making process was. In terms of the Italian side, we know that Mussolini gave the order to intern the Jews in early December. So way before any French attempt to hand them over to the Nazi, right? So that wasn't a rescue policy. It was part of an integral part of the fascist persecution, and indeed Italians had interned foreign and certain categories of Italian Jews since June 1940 when Italy entered the war. Then the orders went down the chain of command and eventually reached, like I said, police officer Rosario Barranco, who was a member of the fascist political police, who then started working on this. We know that Donati was involved in the process, and like I said, Donati was probably consulted, actually most likely consulted to pick where to send these Jews. Not out of humanitarian concerns from Barranco, but mostly in order to avoid an issue. Donati could do that for him. He had, like I said, he had many more pressing issues. He was chasing anti-fascists. He was accused of war crimes by the French by the French government after the war. So he wasn't really the typical nice guy. And then we get to the Jewish side. Donati was informed of this decision. How it was presented to him, we don't know. He just, in his testimony, just said there were too many Jews, so the Italians had to do something with them and decided to intern them. So whether or not they realized it was an anti-Jewish measure, I don't know. I suspect they didn't. I suspect that Barranco was very sneaky and cunning in presenting that as an opportunity to concentrate Jews and put them under Italian protection. And then, of course, we have the Jewish community. Again, it's difficult even to call it a community because there were so many sub-communities and people from different parts of Europe that didn't speak the language, didn't have any connections, didn't like each other because of national prejudices or personal. It was a very complicated and messy situation. This débauchage committee that Donati collaborated with was an example of this mosaic of nationalities, of people coming from all over Europe. And we know that there were discussions. We know that actually I found a report in the Joint Distribution Committee archives here in New York that says that this decision of accepting the Italian proposal to intern Jews was a very difficult one to accept, but that they could not refuse it because at the end of the day it was a way to save them, because if they were under Italian authority, that meant that French police could not arrest them. So you see how the Italians in a way blackmailed them, saying, you don't want to go with us? Good luck with the French. More than that, I can't really say because the débauchage committee, I don't think any historian has been able so far to locate their archives, if they exist. But certainly these were very difficult decisions. Jewish leaders had to weigh in a number of things. And again, like I said, they had to go for the least bad decision in that case. And my impression, as far as Donati was concerned, was that he trusted the Italians. And so somehow he lobbied, say, let's go with them.
Was not always a good, well-placed trust. We have two questions, and I'll ask you to be very brief.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I'll be very brief. You mentioned the Italian racial laws. They were actually given a small veneer of respectability by all the prominent intellectual and artists signing a manifesto per la difesa della razza. And what was interesting is after the war, about 90% of them went on with their career, either a university teacher or artist, etc. Nothing was done to them. That would always be totally amazed by that.
that's
Because he was given respectability by the fact that all these important people sign as the Italian race, whatever
Absolutely.
that means. It's a kind of misnomer, but that it needs to be defended. We don't know from what. But
No, it is true. I mean, there was been no real extended action of recognition and
Right.
restitution and understanding. I mean, until the late 1980s,
right,
um,
when they were all dead.
people have not, Italy has not really invested in studying and understanding.
Absolutely, because
the
I asked,
persecution.
how come this person went out with this great university? Ma la graduatoria.
Absolutely. No, none of the positions taken away from the Jews were returned. I mean, it's
Right.
no.
And what about the concentration camp in Trieste?
What about it?
Well, did he know about it? I mean.
Sure, we know a lot. I mean, now we know about.
Did Donati know about it?
Possibly after the war, but
Yeah, it's,
but I mean,
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a very.
Okay.
Yes, was Donati personally affected, his personal property, his own assets in France affected by the French Vichy governments and the other, and the occupied French governments, laws to expropriate the property and businesses, the assets of Jews in France?
well, yes. In the archives in Paris, I found two dossiers. One relating to a society, to an enterprise. It was based a company. Thank you. Company based in Paris, Société Parisienne de Mode, and another one in Nice. So the first one was expropriated by the German authorities, who actually started first. Then July 41. The Vichy government tried to catch up, so to speak, and so the second one was taken away from Donati by the Vichy government. Although eventually he managed to obtain they sold the property. He managed to eventually get his money back, but in a way his investment was gone. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.